Well, welcome back to this week's Wowhead Weekly News Recap. We have a couple of things to discuss this week. First and foremost, we have the War Within release date, kind of talking about when that's coming out and what's going to be kind of encompassing that. And then on top of that, we also have the War Within beta M Plus dungeons being available for testing. So those are available for testing. There is also some new affixes. Blizzard also released a pretty large blue post discussing their philosophy in regards to the new affixes. And so we're going to kind of take a second to look and give my thoughts just generally about what we've actually been seeing from the beta testing and the affixes as a whole. But first thing to tackle, the War Within releases August 26th. Early access on the 22nd. So I thought it was 3 days initially of early access, but apparently it's 4 days of early access. Basically, what early access does for those who have purchased the Epic Edition of the War Within is it allows players to basically just level. There's not really much you can do aside from leveling inside of the dungeons, inside of the game. It's not like you're going to be able to get any gear advantage, any real advantage inside of the game. There might be some stuff that you're going to be able to do at max level, like professions, and get that started as just a bit of a Kickstarter. But in general, there's no tangible, progression-based advantage, I guess is how I would describe it, with being able to level 4 days earlier. Now, obviously, players aren't thrilled. I think I've seen a lot of negative community sentiment about an MMO having early access just in general, just because it feels kind of icky. But this is one of the things that, Blizzard's just going to push forward with the early access. Mop Remix ends on the 19th, which is a little bit less than a week before the early access launch date, and it's a full week before the official launch date. And so, yeah, basically those are, if you have the Epic Edition, that's how you're going to be able to get access to the early access. Now, let's talk about some of the other stuff. Now, M Plus is now available for testing on the beta. So if you want, and you already have the beta, you can go start testing right now. Don't even wait for the end of this video. However, let's kind of go through some of the stuff that we saw with what the beta M Plus testing holds and what Blizzard has kind of stated in some of the blue posts that we've seen over the past couple of days. So first and foremost, there's actually going to be very minimal changes to heroic and mythic dungeons from what we've seen from season 4. Blizzard's going to try to make them remain a cornerstone of in-game content, where heroic dungeons and mythic dungeons and M0 dungeons are going to rotate every single season to match the current season's dungeon pool. So say for season 3, how it had Everbloom and Waycrest Manor and Ataldazar inside of those keys, it's going to have, Waycrest Manor, Ataldazar, and Everbloom inside of those keys. For season 1, returning dungeons like Necrotic Wake and Mist of Tyranid Scythe are also going to be a part of the heroic and mythic dungeon pool. On top of that, there was some other stuff that we learned, including that Mythic will end up starting with the Season 1 of War Within. Mythic difficulty will feature a roster of seasonal dungeons. And so by starting with Season 1 of the War Within, that means that it's starting on September 10th, I think is the date that is beginning. As opposed to in the past where M0s were done the same week that you would level. Now you're going to level your character. You're going to be able to do heroic dungeons, either queuable or walk-in heroic dungeons, to be able to get the best gear. And then after the season launches, you're going to be able to do M0, you're going to be able to do M+, you're going to be able to go into normal and heroic raid. They did add back Mythic Week, which is a moniker that players used to talk about, where there was a separation between heroic raid launching and mythic raid launching, so that's not all launching at the same time. At this current time, Blizzard hasn't stated what the cap is going to be for Mythic Plus dungeon level, if there is going to be, or if there is going to be a cap for Mythic Plus dungeon level. At this current time, it seems likely that there will be a cap for the M Plus dungeon level at the max level rewards that you can get from end of dungeons. I have a suspicion it could even be as low as M0. I have a suspicion that it's probably going to be like a 4 or something, just looking at historical data at what item level they allow you to get from M+, meaning that there's, a lot less incentive of speed running, a ton of M0 or M+ dungeons on week 1 of the season launching. Instead, you're still using it as a more of a gearing process as opposed to a mad dash to the finish for gear progression. On top of that, for those who don't know, the seasonal dungeon roster is going to include the Stone Vault, Dawnbreaker, Arakar, and City of Threads. Those are all 4 of the I almost called it Dragonflight. Those are all 4 of the War Within dungeons. I'm going to give some thoughts about these dungeons in just a second. And then the 4 returning dungeons are Grim Batol, Necrotic Wake, Mist of Tyranid Scythe, and Siege of Borealis. So 3 of these dungeons we've actually seen in the M+ format before, and Grim Batol is a Cataclysm dungeon, which is infamous for having, like this Dragon Ride RP in the middle of the dungeon on Cataclysm. And so, generally the Cataclysm dungeons have to have the most time put into them, and they largely get reworked into basically full-fledged new dungeons. Okay, so for affixes, actually let's talk about the M+ system as a whole. They're changing where you're getting affixes. In the past, for Season 4, you were actually getting your 3rd set of affixes at a +10 level. Basically, everybody was doing a 9, right? And so Blizzard didn't like that, so now you're getting your 3rd set of affixes at a 7. And crests drop from a 9. So now you're going to have 3 sets of affixes if you want the aspect equivalent crests. So you're going to be able to have to actually do, higher keys to be able to get crests in a more meaningful manner. Yeah. For affixes, Blizzard actually, I think that they actually have a pretty good finger on the pulse as to what players are looking for with affixes. Before we dive into the specifics of the new affixes, we would also like to outline our goals and the purposes that these affixes serve. Our overarching goal is to minimize the mechanical overlap between affixes and dungeon trash design in the current +4 affix bucket. We aim to achieve this through a more passive approach, focusing on the following objectives. First off, shifting the focus into the dungeon itself, which is great. Reducing visual noise. I think the visual noise and telegraphing of abilities in Mythic Plus has been a bit brutal at times, especially whenever they're starting to add more mechanics to trash. And so reducing visual noise and having better VFX, awesome. Allowed for varied and context-specific gameplay decisions depending on the dungeon they're applied to. And this is a bit interesting because this could be interpreted a bunch of different ways, but you'll see exactly what they're meaning in a second. Additionally, these affixes will include a positive effect. The aim of the positive effect is to highlight the different damage types each week, allowing each specialization additional opportunities to excel during the season. These effects should feel like a bonus, offering an advantage for different damage profiles each week without being essential to completing a dungeon. And then players will have an opportunity to flex towards different talents, gearing options, and consumables to capitalize on these effects. So with that said, the 4 new affixes in the new affix bucket are Reckless, Thorned, Attuned, and Focus. And so all of these have a curse element to them. And the curse element for Reckless is non-boss enemies without mana ignore 20% of the armor of their attacks. For Thorned, it's non-boss enemies without mana inflict physical damage to their attackers when attacked. For Attuned, it's non-boss enemies with mana inflict 20% increased magic damage. And then for Focus, it's non-boss enemies with mana have 30% increased haste. So for the non-boss enemies with mana and without mana, basically these affect no bosses. So the with and without mana thing, there's a flag on nameplates for pretty much all of the mobs inside of M+ that you're able to tell what's attuned, reckless, thorned, not. Additionally, the mobs, I would describe them as like highlighted. They have like these weird animations surrounding them, and they're like recolored, and they're like slightly glowing whenever they're affected by that affix. As for the with mana and without mana thing, it's kind of a weird one to go through. In general, it's like kind of hard to tell what mobs have and don't have mana, but not a lot of mobs per dungeon per week actually are affected by that week's affix, whether it be due to the fact that there's not that many mobs with mana, there's not that many mobs without mana in a specific dungeon. So in general, you're going to have probably at most like 60% of the mobs, 70% of the mobs maybe, that are going to be affected. But in general, it's going to be like, especially with these mana ones, it's definitely less than half of the mobs are affected with the mana moniker. And so then there's going to be 30% increased haste. Spell haste, spellcasts are going to be a bit faster. Attuned, by and large, non-boss enemies with mana inflicting 20% increased magic damage didn't matter until it was paired with fortified, and then there was like a pretty weird overlap between some of the mobs. But in general, I think the curses haven't mattered so far from what we've seen during PTR testing. Now let's talk about the Kiss style effects. The mob's armor is reduced by 30%, and they take 10% increased arcane damage. This means that anybody who's doing melee swings or white swings on mobs is going to deal a little bit more damage. For Thorned, it's the mobs take 10% increased holy and shadow damage. For attuned, it's increased nature damage and 30% increased damage from bleed effects. And then for focused, it's 10% increased frost and fire damage. And so these kiss style effects, from my experience playing, haven't been strong enough to necessarily move the needle in terms of what you think is strong. Like right now on the beta, what you think is strong is probably going to be strong almost regardless of whether or not what week is active. It's kind of an interesting paradigm where so far I'm not sure if they've necessarily gone far enough with these kiss style effects, but what the goal of these are is to, you know, have players an opportunity to flex towards different talents, gearing options, and consumables to capitalize on these effects. And then also these effects should feel like a bonus, offering advantage for different damage profile types each week without feeling essential to completing a dungeon. I would describe this as feeling like the damage gain from Thundering, which if you played Season 1 of Dragonflight, you kind of know what I mean, where Thundering was a mini game where you actually kind of wanted to optimize how much damage you were gaining whenever Thundering was on you. But in general, like, nobody was actually going to be doing that. And kind of the kiss part of this, I actually think this is a good step. But I don't think it's actually going to end up accomplishing their goals, where I don't think that players are going to notice on a week-to-week basis what feels better about doing 10% increased arcane damage to, you know, let's say half the trash mobs in a dungeon. But in general, it's like, it's really hard to notice unless you were very, very religiously looking at like a damage meter. And that's a bit weird, right? Is that you don't really notice that you're doing more damage to these mobs. You don't feel like you're doing more damage to these mobs unless you've, you know, unless you're doing like A/B testing or something like that and following your rotation perfectly. Yeah, so that's what we've kind of seen with the Kiss Curse affixes. On top of that, I probably should have covered this a bit before, but they're actually changing the bucket of affix sets. So the current affix 4 bucket will be retired, which is Afflicted, Incorporeal, Entangling, Storming, Volcanic. And then to match the number of affixes or level 4 affix bucket to align with our affix goals, the War Within affixes will be retiring Spiteful in Season 1 of the War Within, and the 7 affix bucket will include the following: Raging, Bolstering, Bursting, and Sanguine. And this has been met with a lot of backlash in the community, where players are pretty upset that Raging, Bolstering, and Sanguine are being kept around. I think that Bursting is honestly one of the most polarizing affixes from a high-end level to a, you know, more casual key pushing level, where high-end healers are by and large pretty okay with Bursting. But average healers and average groups are going to have a significantly harder time dealing with bursting appropriately, whether that be because the mobs have lower HP, so the bursting is easier to roll, players aren't pressing defensives appropriately versus bursting, or in some situations, you know, a very skilled healer is going to be able to keep their group alive and ramp perfectly versus the bursting, where an average healer is going to maybe struggle a little bit in that element where it's a bit harder to have like this perfect healing ramp set up. And in general, it's probably a combination of all three of those things is why bursting is a bit harder in, you know, average level keys as opposed to like the top end. So, you know, I think there's a discrepancy in that affix. But in general, Raging, Bolstering, and Sanguine, incredibly unfun for the mass populace, and there was a lot of criticism as to, I don't want to see them continuing to include these affixes. Instead, I would really like them to align with their goal of shifting the source of the challenge to the dungeon itself by simplifying affix design, and then, you know, have Entangling stay, have Volcanic and Storming potentially stay, as opposed to Raging, Bolstering, and Sanguine. Because Sanguine, you know, there is some counterplay, but unless you have like a perfect displacement, you're going to be healing the mobs, and that feels bad. For Bolstering, tanks by and large hate the experience that Bolstering provides. It's good in design in the sense of like you should be killing mobs like that, but it's really bad in design of, you know, you do a large trash pull, and then your tank has to kite out the trash pack, and that just, you know, their role feels really bad whenever they're doing something like that. And then for Raging, there's only one mass soothe in the game, and it's from Evoker. And even if they hit the godlike 360 no scope mass soothe of the decade, if, you know, you can still have like issues with caster mobs and CC and stuff like that. And it just feels really bad to wipe to Raging whenever you're like, I played that near perfectly, and this is just, it just is really, really punishing. I would say Raging being changed to have CC immunity feels incredibly punishing. Anyways, so that's all the changes that we've seen into the M+ system. Now for the dungeons themselves, there was some dungeon stuff related to dungeons that you might have seen in the past. Oh my gosh, if I can speak. For Siege of Borealis, the spotter sighted artillery no longer damages enemy creatures, meaning that you're no longer carrying a spotter around the entire key. Also, players of both factions will go through the Alliance side version of the dungeon on M0 and M+. There's actually a pretty large difference between these. So first and foremost, there's a plethora of Irontide Raiders and Blacktar Bombers on the Alliance side that were not present on the Horde side. The Horde side had a lot easier mobs. And so in general, I think the Alliance side had a lot more challenges in regards to what mobs they have available. On top of this, for Borealis, in addition to the spotter no longer dealing damage to enemy targets, they've also removed a lot of free count from gutters and changed the mobs a lot in Borealis, if you remember doing it in the past. In general, these things make sense. They needed to unify which side of Borealis you were getting. A lot of people actually kind of wanted the Horde side of Borealis because the mob types were a little bit easier, but I think it makes sense that they just need to pick one. It doesn't necessarily matter too much, and then they can tune around that. For Necrotic Wake, they've removed all the Forge Hammers. I don't really know why, but they removed all the Forge Hammers. They disabled the Kyrian Affix Goliath, where you were able to do like a just Jillian AoE with these Goliaths. And then they added new spots for the Bloody Javelins. They added new spots for the shield, and they changed the functionality of the Javelin and the shield. So the Javelin now no longer does like a ton of damage. Instead, it now applies a staggering vulnerability to enemies' hit. And so I believe it's 20% per Javelin. And so whenever you throw a few Javelins at a mob, you're actually able to do a significant amount of damage. And I actually have a clip from my stream where we threw, I want to say it was 3, but it might have even been 4 Javelins at the second boss of Necrotic Wake. And then from here on out, we are absolutely cooking this boss. If you can see on screen here, this boss is taking just 100% increased damage from the Javelin. The Javelin also does some incidental damage, which is why you see our Resto Shaman. He threw his Javelin last, and so he got the brunt of the multiplicative effect of the Javelin damage. And so whenever you throw a bunch of your Javelins into a boss, a trash pack, or just in general into a mob, you're going to be killing that boss or trash pack or whatever off very fast. And so stacking them multiplicatively is sick. For the shields, the shield is no longer a channel effect, and now you basically just press it, you get the DR effect within the circle, and then you're able to actually continue to cast and deal damage while the shield is active. And this makes the shield a lot more valuable because now you have actually a purpose of using it. Where in the past, having to channel a shield to get, I don't remember what it was, 20% DR or something like that, was a bit of a joke. Nobody's pressing that shield and holding it for DR. And so now being able to use abilities while the shield is active and it no longer being a channel effect is actually pretty solid. On top of that, the Mythic Scythe Maze has been updated, where there were checkpoints that were gated behind Night Fae characters, and there were versatility mushroom buffs that were gated behind Night Fae characters. And now these Vine gates have been changed to be checked by Tauren, High Mountain Tauren, Night Elf, Druids, and Herbalists. So even if you aren't any of these race or class combinations, you can actually go pick up Herbalism and open up the Mythic Scythe gates. I would in general have preferred if the gates weren't a thing, and so there weren't, profession / class based changes. But I think that these are really wide reaching. There's a lot of stuff that you can use here, especially like the high end. You're going to have a Night Elf in every group, but that's pretty good. I think in general this is like pretty annoying for casual players who probably, you would argue, need the checkpoint more, right? Where again, high-end groups are going to have a Nelf in every single run they do, because Night Elf is just really good. Shadow Meld is very overpowered, and so I'm not worried about this for like people like me, like high key pushers. I am a bit worried about this for like average players, where I feel like you should maybe just open this up for literally anybody who clicks the vines. We also have some dungeon timers that were data mined, and I would say on average, this season is maybe a little bit longer than the past couple of seasons. I think this is maybe a little bit longer than what we saw across all of Dragonflight, with a few 36s and a 35 and a 38 even. We don't have anything that's cresting the 40-minute mark, so we don't have like a no-coup defensive equivalent or whatever. But in general, yeah, this season has no super long dungeons like Uldaman, although City of Threads being 38 minutes would feel like an Uldaman in regards to how long it is. So I'm going to take a second to give, just in general, my thoughts about what we've seen so far. For the dungeons, I think let's talk about the cons and then the pros, because I don't want to end on cons. I'll just talk about the cons first. I think the trash design is actually quite challenging in a lot of these dungeons. I think that the trash is very, very difficult in some aspects, probably too hard. I would say that they also added a lot of anti-synergy to the trash itself, where you're not able to double up in double pull packs, because there are mobs in a lot of these dungeons where they do this stacking vulnerability thing where you're going to be taking increasing damage from the next cast that mob is doing. And then it's like stacking this permanent buff on you, meaning that you're not able to actually pull multiple packs at a time. And this happens in like Stone Vault, this happens in Mist of Tyrna Scythe, this happens in Grim Batol, where you're not actually able to like double or triple pull a trash pack that you would have otherwise in the past probably have double or triple pulled. In that regard, I also think that the trash mobs have, I would describe it as far too many mechanics. I think that the trash mobs are really trying to slow you down in a lot of these dungeons, and I mean, for good reason. That's Blizzard's goal, right? Is to add friction and create a challenge, but it just feels like it's in the wrong way. On top of that, from a DPS perspective, there's no like, I would describe it as a fungeon, where a dungeon where you actually are just like there to parse big AoE numbers. That is, in my opinion, one of the most fun parts of Mythic Plus, is doing these massive pulls. The first pull of Algathar Academy, for example, the big crab pull in Eye of Ashara, these pivotal pulls, that make M+, that like, freehold as a dungeon, like type pulls, where you're pulling 12, 13, 15, maybe even potentially 20 mobs at a time and doing max damage to them. Where in reality, a lot of these dungeons, their upper bound is like, 8 mobs or something like that. And I don't think that feels particularly fun. I would have loved to have seen a dungeon designed where you were actually able to pull a lot more just in general. And I think that those are basically the biggest cons for me. I guess I will say there's another one where I feel like these dungeons are dealing far too much damage relative to healer power right now. So I think that Blizzard lowering healer power makes a lot of sense. Healers are a lot weaker right now than they were basically ever in Dragonflight, which is fine. Now, the downside of that is that I don't think that damage has been retroactively changed appropriately to work with how weak healers are. So whenever healers are weak, the damage has to be a lot smoother just as a profile to be able to allow the healers to match that. But instead, it's actually still a very spiky damage profile in M+ with weak healers, and so it feels really bad. And we're actually getting a very similar situation to what we saw last expansion in Dragonflight, where everything feels very one-shotty, where you're super reliant as a healer on your DPS and your tank to either press a defensive or they're going to die, or they're going to have to keep themselves alive. And then as a healer, you're going to have very little agency. And that's just due to the way that Blizzard is in M+, the damage type that they're giving you. If damage was a lot smoother and a lot more frequent, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But whenever you're taking a health bar and a half over like a 6-second period, that is prime candidate for press defensive or die, as opposed to press a defensive for damage mitigation. And I think that those are very different things. For the positives, I actually think that Blizzard is kind of close in regards to these Kiss Curse affixes. I think initially my initial reaction to the Kiss Curse affixes was pretty negative, kind of similar to a lot of the community people. In general, I think that this is a situation where I think that they're a lot closer than players initially thought. I don't know if they're going far enough with the damage gain. I also don't think that it necessarily should have been locked behind spell school types. I think they could have gone as broad as these mobs take increased magic damage and they take increased physical damage. I think that they could have really gone as broad as that, as opposed to blocking it behind specific spell school types, which creates this weird situation where it's like, is your Havoc Demon Hunter meta every single week? If you bump this number up, does a Havoc Demon Hunter become meta every single week because they're always going to be affected by this thing? So I think they're actually pretty close in regards to affixes. I also think the affix system in general it could be fixed. I don't think that Blizzard is married to the concept of it has to be raging, bolstering, bursting, and sanguine. And I think with continued feedback, maybe they'll walk that back. Because I think it's pretty clear that players don't want these affixes. I think that they would much prefer some of the ones from here, not incorporeal and afflict. Those are cringe. But another pro, and I think that people like a lot of times enjoy kind of trashing on bosses in M+, but I think that the bosses have actually been pretty well designed all throughout what we've seen from this dungeon set, where the bosses are a lot more dynamic than they have been in the past, where I think they're actually pretty cool. They have some interesting mechanics by and large, and it's like they're doing things differently. But this kind of goes into the con where I don't think that bosses necessarily make M+ for a lot of people. I think the trash design is definitely the point where players are like super on board. Where I think that the bosses are more just like, if this is a nuisance, this is really problematic, and this is kind of annoying. But I think the bosses have actually been pretty well designed, and they have some of the cooler bosses I've ever seen. Like even if you're looking on screen right here, this last boss of Grim Batol, I think that this boss, it feels like a good M+ boss is how I would describe this. With what you're doing and like what you're trying to achieve with this, it doesn't feel like this is like an overwhelmingly annoying kind of M+ boss. And I think in general they did a pretty good job with the bosses across this season. As for other positives, I think that Blizzard is continuing to move the game in the right direction. I don't love the dungeon design. I think that I think the dungeon design is maybe the piece that's lacking the most. But I think in general, it's like Blizzard is continuing to move Mythic Plus forward. They're continuing to have unifying goals that kind of align with the players in a lot of instances. The return of rotating dungeons from season to season is phenomenal. I'm a huge fan of that, and I think that that's going to make M+ just as a game mode going to feel better and unique every single season. And I think in general, it's like M+ is still going to be fun for players to play. I think that those are like huge pros for the system just as a whole. It's always easy to get caught up with just dooming and like what are the cons and just kind of complaining, but I think it's you have to kind of view it from a lens of, is this still fun to play? And I think in general M+ is still going to be very fun to play, and I hope that the War Within is going to be sick for all players involved. We're going to be back here next week talking about some more of the news. Again, early access begins August 22nd. The game releases on August 26th. If you have the Epic Edition pre-ordered or purchased, you will be getting early access on the 22nd. So anyways, I'll be back next week to kind of talk about some more of the stuff that we've been seeing in the War Within Alpha and the news for the week. And that will conclude this week's video. Goodbye.